In this final video, we'll briefly discuss some common questions and kind of answers, I guess, to pre-registration. I think it's useful to discuss some of these questions that typically come up to try and hopefully alleviate a few of the worries, while also think about the way that pre-registration might be the most useful to your own research. Okay. So, two pages that are really useful are the Centre for Open Science page for pre-registration and the one for registered reports. Both have fairly extensive Q&As and also link to webinars and similar to give even more information than we could ever possibly fit into these short videos. Okay. A really common question that comes up is this one about exploratory analyses. It comes up in a number of guises, whether that's that registered reports will do exploratory analyses, or that the pre-registration format is trying to make confirmatory analyses the core of research and ignoring the benefit of exploratory analyses. I would argue it's not, for the simple reason that one can always include exploratory analyses. They're just as useful for exploring the data to generate hypotheses. I think the big distinction, more than anything else, is whether those exploratory analyses are communicated as if they are confirmatory or not, which is a huge problem. To do so, it's a big kind of harking thing. It's potentially a reason for low reproducibility in some areas. This kind of way of presenting exploratory, so I've tried 50 analyses and this is the one that worked, as if that was the one that I planned all along. It's also worth mentioning that Cortex, I believe, the journal that initially offered registered reports, also offers an exploratory report format. It's heavily undersubscribed. The cynic in me would argue that that's because most researchers want their research to be seen as confirmatory, so that they are testing a hypothesis rather than being exploratory about it. It's also the case that most of the most commonly used statistics, particularly null hypothesis significance testing, isn't particularly appropriate for many exploratory analyses, particularly if alpha is not controlled, particularly if the study is low powered, and problems similar to this. So exploratory analyses are perfectly fine within pre-registrations. The core thing to me is the transparency around whether they are communicated as being exploratory analyses or as confirmatory ones. The second question that comes up a lot is, what if the study plan changes? What if we couldn't reach our target sample? What if there was a mistake and we couldn't analyze a measure, but we can analyze another comparable one? Now, there's lots of things that can happen in the research pipeline that change the study itself, that change the sampling, that change the measures, that change the analysis plan. A really simple one is, well, the assumptions of my statistical tests were broken and I now need to do robust or bootstrapped analyses. Maybe you've learned a new technique and that would actually be more appropriate. Great, do it. Now that's perfectly fine within the pre-registration template. Within the registered report template, you may have to also communicate with the journal that you're changing the plan and communicate why. Depending on the journal, you may want to do that before you analyze the data. Again, so that we're kind of controlling for some of these biases, and so that the timeline itself makes it very clear that these changes were made because they are the more feasible or the better analytic option, as opposed to being because we tried this one thing and it didn't work, so we tried another thing and it did. So plans can change. They should change a lot of the time. A key is being transparent about those changes in order that we can have a more open and reproducible research landscape. Now, a really common concern, now this again is more of a statement than a question, but a really common concern is that pre-registration may take too long, maybe too complex, too difficult, and would slow down progress. Now, there's different elements to this. So first I'll mention registered reports, and then I'll mention pre-registration. In the context of registered reports, I think there's a strong argument to say that the time that you spend setting up the study, so writing the registered report, submitting it, getting feedback, having that go through review, changing anything that needs to be changed, and so on. Yes, that can take some time. However, what I think is worth considering is the time benefit of not having to go through those same multiple rounds of reviews at the end of the study. I like to think of it as I would rather have a reviewer 2 in the lab group with me as I'm designing a study than I would rather have a reviewer 2 at the end of the process when I can't do anything to improve the study itself. Now, depending on the journal, depending on the standards, it might be that that the research actually requires, for example, higher power, many more participants. Now, in that case, yes, it will take longer because you're being asked to meet a higher standard of rigor, of statistical power to be able to ask the questions that you want to ask in the first place. Now, I would argue that that's actually not really anything to do with the pre-registration or registered reports format so much as it's about trying to do the best research possible and trying to actually have enough data points to address the question that you're wanting to ask in the first place. It can be a long process, pre-registration in general. So we'll move a little bit more into pre-registration in general now, as opposed to registered reports. Now, in this case, you're still front-loading the work. You're planning your analysis. Some people, when I ran a pre-registration, for example, I was able to put the code together so that when I had the data, I clicked go and I had my results. So yes, I spent a few weeks writing up the pre-registration, spent a bit longer putting together the code. However, it saved me a lot of time at the back end because I'd already figured out a lot of the issues around what do I need to control for, what do I need to include in the analysis, how am I going to process the data, how am I going to deal with outliers. All of these kind of questions are already answered beforehand. So at that point, it's a case of following the decisions that you've already made, rather than, I think, what is normally the research procedure of, I've got a data set, I best figure out what to do with it now. And being able to get to that stage of the research with a firm plan in hand is really useful. There are aspects that will take longer. It's very possible that your first, second pre-registration will be really complicated, will take you a long time. I think that's useful because often the reason that it takes a long time is because it forces you to ask questions about the viability of the research and the quality of the research and the data collection plan and the analysis often before we normally would in the process. That said, it may be that depending on your particular stage of the research or the amount of time that you have within contracts and so on, the pre-registration may be a time commitment that you can't make at the start of the study. In that case, I would argue to take the buffet approach to open science and pick a different practice that you might want to adopt. For example, you might look at sharing the data afterwards, or preprinting so that anybody can access the study when you've published it. There's always something that you can do to make your work more open, more reproducible. If pre-registration isn't the one, there's usually another. Okay. The final question, is pre-registration worth it? I think yes. I think that's obvious because I'm giving this workshop. I would argue that pre-registration is worth it because you can be reasonably certain, especially if you've put the effort into doing a good pre-registration, that the work itself is worth more. The more work has been put in to eliminate the many biases, or many of the biases that could bias the results, that could skew our interpretations of them. In terms of the rigor of the field at large, I would say that it's well worth it. To be able to, in the case of registered reports, publish null results, to be able to hold high standards of rigor, and that's what determines whether research is published as opposed to the direction of results or the interestingness of results. Ultimately, it gives us a tool to reduce the biases in our work, to increase the rigor, to allow us to think more deeply and slowly about the process, and to do so before we're constrained by the data that we've collected. All in all, I would argue strongly that pre-registration is worth it. It's not to say that it's easy, but the difficulties involved, I think, are largely down to dealing with issues that many of us haven't been formally taught, or that aren't normally done at that stage in the research cycle. Again, I would argue that this is better. So, thank you from me. Thank you for joining me to talk about pre-registration. If you have any further questions, I'm sure that I can be contacted. My email address should be attached to everything. Really happy to represent Fort as part of the ICA conference. I hope that everybody is healthy, safe and well, and that you hopefully enjoyed, hopefully learned something from our journey into pre-registration together. So thank you and enjoy your open science journey.